Welcome to the Intentionists podcast, where we explore the interplay between intuition, spiritual health, and everything in between. I'm your host, Amy Schreiber.
And I'm Hilary Zwallen. Our intention is to create a dialogue that inspires you to consciously forge your path with curiosity and compassion for life and its mysteries.
Welcome to episode 55. Today, Hilary welcomes transformative leadership expert Mark Nicolson to discuss his work in leadership development and the role of psychedelic plant medicine in reconnecting us to the earth and raising collective awareness. He speaks of his journey in and out of an imperialistic matrix and how he now works to create spaces that enable people to give voice to the destructive parts of themselves so they can be repurposed to align what they do with who they want to be. He shares the correlation between empathy and power, narcissism and colonialism, lessons from Desmond Tutu's birthday party, and the need for supportive networks to combat the isolation of leadership. He reveals how his capacity for connection has been strengthened and transformed through both a supportive men's group and the experience of taking ayahuasca. And he discusses the current research being done with psychedelic drugs for healing trauma and other psychiatric issues. So there's a ton of fascinating information in here. Hilary and Mark talk a lot about transforming power structures and oppressive systems. So it's some really relevant information whether you are in a direct position of leadership or you exist within these structures, which is all of us. But before we launch into the interview, some background on Mark. Mark Nicolson, founder of the Nicholson Group and co-founder of Ventana Group, has coached thousands of organizations, teams, and individuals to achieve peak performance. He has been consulting and teaching for over 20 years on transformative leadership, and in September 2012 delivered a TEDx talk on how leaders learn. His clients include such companies as IDEO, Sony, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and Desmond Tutu and his family foundation. Mark's passion for continuous learning led him to get an MBA from Stanford and 2 other MAs, one in classical literature from Oxford and one in psychology from Meridian University. Earlier in his career, Mark worked in investment banking in the UK and Hong Kong before becoming a partner in Alexander, which served clients such as McKinsey, Boston Consulting Group, and Goldman Sachs. There, Mark facilitated hundreds of leadership development programs, officer group retreats, and coaching skills workshops in the US, Europe, and elsewhere. He designed and led the team integration process after the merger of Glaxo and Wellcome, which created Britain's then largest company. For 4 years, he worked with the whole UK organization up to board level to develop team effectiveness and support individual leadership during times of change and stress. And in the late 90s, exhausted and depressed from his life in London, he took a sabbatical to discover the secrets of a life of balance, play, joy, and contribution. He spent 2 years managing the garden at Esalen Institute, and this experience inspired his life and work philosophy, that our reactions to everyday experience, like fear and anger, can be transformed into leadership capacities like courage and fierceness through special forms of support and challenge. Mark has a gift for connecting people into their own natural intelligence and boundless resources. In working with thousands of leaders, he has seen that coaching capabilities are the key to building successful relationships at all levels in organizations. And he is committed to inspiring and supporting the development of these capabilities in leaders of all values-driven organizations. And you can find him online at nicholsongroup.com, and the website for the leadership training is t12n.com. And without further delay, here's Mark and Hilary.
Mark, thank you so much for joining me today.
Delighted to be here.
First, I wanted to just share with our listeners why I wanted to have you in particular on the podcast, because we have a history where you were a facilitator at a leadership network that I was a part of. And you are really like, you're probably the most, I tell people, I'm like, he's the smartest person I know, both like intellectually and emotionally. Like he's emotionally intelligent and intellectually intelligent. And so it's really fun to talk to you because you have really unique perspectives because you've done a lot of your own work and you have a really humongous brain. And so I just think it's going to be great for our listeners to kind of hear your perspective. You work in transformational leadership and really the space that you created in the leadership network that we did, I feel like I'm still processing and mining the gold that came from that experience. And so
Thank
So with
you.
that, yes.
Well, let me also lower the bar a little bit for the listeners.
So with that, yes, exactly.
I had, as we were talking about earlier, a very challenging morning already as a parent. So there's a lot of things that I am very, very much still at my learning edge on.
Well, as we all are, and there's that emotional intelligence shining through, just like I said. So. Okay, so I'd love for you to tell our listeners a little bit about your background, and then we can segue into kind of the transformational leadership portion. But tell us about, like, what is your life's work that you're doing right now?
Yeah, great. Thank you. Well, in summary, what I do is I create the spaces for people to have really difficult conversations about themselves and each other. And that's usually in a context of people's professional lives, and whether within an organization, so working with a team or with a team that's running an organization, or working with people who are coming to, I have a year-long leadership program that I run where people come mostly from professional contexts to really explore who they want to be and how to get fully aligned between who they are and what they do. And the experience you had was one of those experiences, which was where I was facilitating a convening of a bunch of incredible cross-sector leaders from a particular location. So they're creating the space for people to have really difficult and challenging conversations about themselves and each other.
Yes, I really have never done anything like it. And I feel like the experience was so profound, especially the diversity of the people in the group and the friendships that I've made. I feel like were absolutely life-changing. So really powerful work that you do. So how did you get to this place? Because you didn't start here. Let's go all the way back, because I know you had mentioned earlier that you're a Brit,
Yes.
right? Or are you an American now?
I'm both.
You're an American and a Brit. But tell me a little bit about what it was like growing up and how you meandered to this path.
Okay. Well, one piece of information that I really like to tell people now in my story is that my great-grandfather was one of the wealthiest people in Britain when he died in the mid-1940s, just actually right in the middle of the Second World War. And he had accumulated his wealth through being a textile distributor, which, of course, was one of the main spoils of the British Empire, were textiles that had been cheaply made in other parts of the world, and in England at one point. And he had the most beautiful house and gardens in the city of Birmingham, the second biggest city in England. And he left them on his death to the University of Birmingham. And that house still exists. He left them on the condition that the grounds and gardens were kept in the manner to which he had made them beautiful. And that house, which is called Winterbourne, is now the third most popular attraction in the city of Birmingham on TripAdvisor.
Oh my God.
The third most highly rated. And, there's so much in that story. But some of the essential pieces are that, firstly, my grandfather didn't want to inherit it because he came back from the First World War with PTSD and everything was too stressful for him. So he didn't want to have to manage 15 full-time gardeners. So that was one important piece, which was basically, how that wealth was lost in one generation, but there was just enough that was left to pass on to my parents that enabled me to go to boarding school at the age of 7. The important piece about that is that the way that I describe what that boarding school was is that it was a training to become an imperialist or to become a colonizer. So we were, in essence, completely deprived of any nurturing. We were basically tortured. I mean, it's perhaps a little extreme, but we were in constant fear of being humiliated and being hit. And I saw kids bleed. I saw kids get hit. I saw kids get their hair pulled out. I saw broken bones. Not every day, but I saw some physical violence every single day. And that was an unusually sadistic school, but not absolutely unusual in terms of British culture, in terms of the upper class of the British culture. And the essence of that was that it was training people to become governors and of the empire in different parts of the world, in essence.
Kind of to harden them to the point where seeing extreme circumstances like that, it's like, well, whatever, I was raised this way. This is how it works.
Yes.
And that's the way it is.
Exactly.
Wow.
Exactly. the dehumanization that starts with the people that are in control, who then dehumanize everybody else.
Oh my God.
So, I mean, it's taken me a long time to realize that that's what I grew into. And of course, there was incredible generosity and caring from my parents, from my family, who were amazing. But they also were caught up in a whole culture that was oriented towards, let's get stuff from other parts of the world and bring it to us and enjoy it. And that may be an extreme description of it, but it's not so far from what some of the colonizing mindsets are that a lot of the Western world is still run on. Racist, sexist, colonizing, and extractive.
Extractive capitalism.
Yeah.
Wow. Yes.
So my plan, mostly unconscious, but a little bit conscious, was I've got to get out of here. And the way I'm going to get out is by doing really well in school. And then I can go to the best colleges, and then I can make a choice. But of course, when you do that, when you use the tools of the master to get out, to some extent, you're always a hostage to those tools.
How do you mean?
So I go to Oxford, and at Oxford, I decide, God, I want to make a lot of money. So I want to get, the way I'm going to get out of this culture is by making a lot of money. And the way you make a lot of money is by using their tools, is by becoming an extractive capitalist. And so I became an investment banker and made a lot of money very quickly, not enough to retire, but, enough to be able to take a year off and then go to business school. But that whole process was just sickening and nauseating for me.
Really?
And I enjoyed the deal making, but I would go home at night and feel nauseous at what it was that I was doing.
So I have a question, because obviously there's this piece of you that was this like sensitivity that somehow was preserved, like it wasn't beaten out of you in that system, because I think other people would have just reacted perhaps differently, or maybe not seen what you're seeing. So what do you think? What do you think was going on in that, with that piece there, where you're saying, was it your conscience? Was it, what do you think it was?
Honestly, I don't know how to explain it. I do, I've read some of this incredible research about what happens to boys and what happens to girls, but at different ages, in order to enculturate themselves. And what happens at boys is at the age of 7, boys are incredibly attuned to the emotional world of the adults around them. Some argue that boys are more attuned than girls at that age to the emotional world of adults.
I could see that with my own kids for sure.
It's amazing. I see it in my niece and nephew. But then they go into a world in which that sensitivity is completely devalued and completely marginalized and humiliated. And I don't know how it is, what it was in me that just put that sensitivity on hold instead of, masking it or numbing it for the rest of my life. I think it still lives in everyone.
Right.
And I think that I just happened to be incredibly lucky that I was smart enough to be able to find my way out and make enough money to be able to take months off and not have to stay in the matrix the whole time. That's one way of explaining it, is that I kept, I'd work, I'd take a bunch of time off and go travel and see the world and learn stuff. And
kind of nurture that creative, more receptive side.
Yes.
I think that really does help, doesn't it?
Yes. And then I did have this experience at the age of 30 with a spiritual teacher that completely blew me open. And the spiritual teacher was an amazing spiritual teacher, not great as a human being, deeply flawed, as so many people who set themselves up as spiritual teachers are.
Right.
Not all, but many. And at the same time, his gifts of the teachings were extraordinary. And something happened where I went through this opening into seeing the truth of who I really am and to see my real nature, my true nature.
And what was that?
I think I like to describe it simply as just pure joy.
Yeah. I get that from you.
It's not always there, but
of course.
But I feel like it, it comes out when I'm not still working with the internalized idea about who I need to be and what I need to become and how much I need to achieve. Yes. That then it just comes out.
Well, and I think you bring up a good point, because that's something that I've even been wrestling with the last 2 weeks, is that it's very discouraging, I think, when you are trying to live a thoughtful, meaningful, joyful life where you are connected to source, or where you are connected, where you feel like you are in love with what's going on around you. And then you still have these like human grenades that are launched like all the time. And so then, we have these wide swaths of emotions that still come up. And so I'm glad you brought that point up, that it's like, you can discover kind of what your purest essence is. And I think this is kind of why we have these practices, whether it's yoga or whatever your spirituality is, or whatever it is that we like, to your point, you create spaces in work environments where people can go back and return to that piece, because we do forget. And maybe it's not that we can't always be that, because maybe we can, but we still do live in this on this planet, and we're still humans. So
exactly. And we've internalized messages about who we are that it's very hard to overturn or to repurpose.
Yes.
One of the practices and exercises that's pretty central to what I do is help people give voice to the parts of them that attack themselves or that are critical of themselves, and make those visible and make them obvious, and see if there's a way to repurpose those or turn them around or shift what those voices are. And those voices are, almost always the voices of sexism and racism.
Yeah.
And it's incredible. Whether I just did it yesterday with a group. I asked everybody in the group to imagine bringing into the world what they would most love to bring into the world, their creative endeavor that they would most like to bring in, and to imagine that. And then to imagine themselves sitting in their critical part of themselves, speaking to that vision. And I asked people to write down what those critical voices were. And I've done this in a lot of different groups. I've done it in groups of people who are, people who are in power, and with social activists and with entrepreneurs. And it's extraordinary how similar they are, what those voices are, that, you're not enough, or you're too much, or you're an imposter, you don't know what you're doing, you don't know enough. And those are all voices of a sexist, racist culture, or of a culture that is structured so that those in power get to stay in power.
So I want to continue down that path for just a second, because you had mentioned that the boarding school was a vehicle for colonialism, superiority. You had even mentioned before we talked that it created a narcissistic society. What do you mean by that? Can you explain that a little bit more?
Well, there's a very strong overlap between a narcissistic personality and a dominant culture, or an oppressive culture, or a colonizing culture. There are very similar aspects to them, which is that I'm strong and you're weak. You depend on me. Any mistakes that are made, it's your fault that they happened. The focus needs to be on me and my needs, and not on you and your needs. And I'm the one that has the expertise and the knowledge, and you're the one that needs to learn from me and be dependent on me. All of those subtle, sometimes not so subtle, but also subtle messages that narcissists bring are also similar to the kinds of messages that those that hold very strong positions of power are also in. And it's painful to name it and witness it, but that little video that went viral of Dianne Feinstein talking to the children in her office, that went viral this week, is extraordinary. It's a very similar thing, which is like, I know what I'm doing. You're young and you don't know what you're doing. I was the one that got voted and have the power. You don't have the power. Don't tell me what to do. I'm the one that's been doing this for a long time. I mean, it's really astonishing. And it was a very instructive video, because I think for people on the left who demonize those on the right, it's really important to look at that and go, well, look, here is someone who is a senator from California who is absolutely verbatim speaking the voices of a colonizing, imperialist, oppressive power structure.
Yeah. Well, and to your point that it's like, it's not always overt, right? Like we have a lot of overt narcissism going on in our culture, but like you said, it starts when you're really young.
Yes.
And it's this idea. I mean, I having been raised in the Mormon culture, and we talked about this in I was not expecting that to be like a common theme throughout the leadership group.
Right.
I thought I'd like dealt with my faith crisis. And then I was like, oh, just kidding. It's right here.
Yes.
And I think the part that I'm still unpacking over and over again is that idea that it's not always easily recognizable. It's not, it's coupled with kindness too. Like to your point, like I'm sure, well, you were saying your parents gave you like kind of a lot of love and support, but that the boarding school is really rough. But I find that sometimes it's the people that are in power can appear benevolent, or they are benevolent in some ways. And yet the dialogue is still disempowering. And the messages that are taken away are still like defer to the male authority. Like you are the wife of the man who has the priesthood, like at least in Mormonism. And I see this not just in Mormonism, but I mean, we see this everywhere. And I think this is where all the rage is coming from. And I also think people are exhausted from the fighting. You know? And so I think we're at this point. And I mean, I don't expect you to have the answers here, but I'm just curious, like, it's kind of like, where do we go next? You know, if we're looking at old paradigm versus new paradigm, and to your point, you're saying you have activists and people are just tired, right? It seems like it's so quick. People are so quick to like get on and grandstand, and it all feels a little, even with the benevolent activists, it sometimes feels a little bit like power mongering. And so I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Gosh, such a beautiful question. All I can offer is, the particular window that I come from, and, it's sort of a combination of, there is very clear research that shows that the more power you have, the less empathy you have. It's not 100% correlation with everybody, but it does seem to be an element of being human, that the more power we have, the less of a capacity we have to be empathic with those who are dependent on us, or those who report to us, or those who are less powerful than us. So, there is that piece of data. And then I love to tell the story also of, I was lucky enough to go to Desmond Tutu's 80th birthday celebration down in Cape Town. And as a part of that celebration, he was interviewed together with the Dalai Lama.
Wow.
And the Dalai Lama was being, beamed in from Dharamsala. And one of the questions was asked was something very similar to this, overlapping with this, which is, how are we going to end war? And the Dalai Lama gave a very beautiful response, which is, in essence, we really need to raise our own individual consciousness as a way to support the evolution of collective consciousness. And Desmond Tutu gave a very different answer, which was, let women take over.
I love that, My power monger is like, yes.
So the whole, there were probably 500 people in this auditorium. Everybody, like as one, stood up immediately and cheered. It was like he had spoken a truth that, and I'm not sure if the words were actually let women take over, but it was something like let women,
lead,
let women lead, or something like that. Yes.
Yeah.
So, I see that both, in the particular, which is, what a difference it makes having 110 new women Congress members, how that changes the conversation.
Very exciting.
But also that, there is an imbalance of masculine and feminine, however you define those, but there is an imbalance of those, and the masculine has been overpowering.
For like 2,000 years or more. Right?
Yeah, I mean, yes, exactly. And it's fascinating how that seems to happen in pretty much every culture.
Right.
It's a very strange phenomenon of who it is that we are.
Well, and like you were saying, this imbalance of masculine and feminine, I wanted to point this out because I can see how, for men who are trying to connect with the more empathetic feminine traits within themselves. I have a lot of empathy for them, because it's a hard world for men to be willing to kind of heal those wounds of their lack of, is it matriarchy? Is it femininity? I'm trying to think of what the word is to describe it, but just being able to be that receptive, all the qualities that we deem as feminine, meaning mysterious, cyclical, receptive,
Yes.
soft, nurturing. These are things that, men are told from, like you were saying, from like the age of even younger than 7, that it's like men are tough. Like we don't feel your feelings or whatever.
Yeah. Well, it's this capacity for attunement is in some ways what I see. What I see in my incredible 5-year-old nephew is his capacity to notice what's going on around him and enter adult conversations. I don't know if he'll keep that or not once, as he gets more and more into the mainstream of British education. But he has this capacity to attune to people around him and to really care of what's going on with everybody. And I think when that gets shut down, it becomes much harder for us to really connect with others. And I know for me, in some ways, the most important way in which I stay connected to that part is I have a men's group, which has an incredible group of men in it who have supported me through every, in the last 15 years, every up and down of my life. And to be in that group and to challenge, the ideas of what it is to be a man that I went to school learning. It takes meeting twice a month with that intention to keep that, to keep that really alive in me.
Wow. And that just goes to kind of the devotion aspect of it. I think oftentimes that word devotion is used in religious context, but I'm really finding a lot of peace and wisdom in discovering that word in new contexts of devotion to self, of devotion to like the commitment of, like you're saying, showing up twice a month. That's a big commitment, when you think about everything going on in your life.
Yeah.
I want to talk about leadership and the isolation of leadership and kind of the work that you do for people who, and just leadership in general. I for our listeners, I know we have stay-at-home moms who have a side hustle. We have people who are starting businesses. We have people who are maybe working in a field, they're sole proprietors. And so this idea of leadership, when I first think of leadership, I always think of like power and like being visible and the head of an organization. Like that's how I have consumed the idea of leadership. And I obviously challenge that now. The way that I view it now is a little bit different in terms of the way that we lead all the time, whether it's our families, whatever context it is that you want to show up and really hold space for changing, shifting, enlightenment. So can you talk to me a little bit about the types of leadership, like who are the people that you're connecting with? Not specifically, but the types of people that you're working with, and what are some of the issues that they feel like we're around isolation or, being, how do they deal with that?
Well, I'm often working with people who are starting organizations and working with them, and perhaps they have a team as well, but working with people who are beginning to bring their idea into the world, whether as a solo entrepreneur or whether as a startup tech company, and supporting them to have a place where they can just absolutely be themselves and not have to be anything to anybody else, because so much of the time they're having to be in some kind of a role, whether it's the role of a boss or reporting to a board. I find that if they have a place where they can talk about the things that they can't really talk about anywhere else, not that there's anything wrong with the rest of their environment, but a lot of the time there's just a certain amount of anxiety or questioning or kind of a diminished self-confidence or not having your courage of your convictions that is inevitable in bringing something new into the world. Because, if it's not in the world already, then people aren't necessarily going to welcome it.
Right. So if you want to do radical shifts, if you want to do radical systems change, radical business ideas that have yet to have ever, like to your point, if no one's ever experienced it, then it's like it almost feels like the immediate reaction is like, that couldn't happen.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
And so you challenge those spaces
and help people to be surrounded by people who both are able to help them make their ambition happen, but also who believe in them and share their values.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of the time, the people that we hang out with when we start an organization are either the people who can make our ambition happen in some way, but who don't necessarily share our values,
Right.
or they're the people who share our values and believe in us, but they can't actually really necessarily make our endeavors happen.
Mm.
So I call them the B players, the people that share our values but can't make it happen. The A players are the people that share our values and can make it happen, and the C players are the people that can make our ambition happen but don't share our values, and who afterwards we kind of feel a little bit yucky about having spent time around. And but we have to find people that can support us in both places.
What would you say to someone who's like, if they're in England or if they're in Kansas City or wherever they are, and like how would they create this? How can we create spaces like this in the micro, in our micro worlds that we live in? You know, this I'm constantly thinking about this, and granted, with what we've done in Modesto, I feel like there are spaces now because of this leadership network that I can go and I find people who share the same values and have the same vision, but I didn't have that before.
Yes.
And so what do we do? What do you suggest for people who are in other spaces, that in other parts of the country where they may feel isolated? Because I know, having run a business myself, I felt like I had to sell the company because I was so, I felt like I was just done. Like I was isolated. I felt alone, especially as a woman. I realized how communal and how much I needed kind of that circular sisterhood that was missing when I was just like a woman living in what felt like a man's world, like in the business world, and we had female employees, but it was different being at the top of the business.
Yeah. So. Well, so I mean, in a simple practical sense, and it's not easy, but it is simple, is find 2 or 3 or 4 other people who are doing something similar to you in some form and meet, whether, by Zoom or phone or in person. There are so many people out there trying to start new things. Everybody is filled with ambition and creativity. There are so many people that are trying to bring beautiful things into the world. I was, every week I'm at an event where there are people trying to bring their beautiful things into the world at different levels. Some people have already done something amazing and some people it's just beginning. Mm-hmm. But whatever it is, there are people out there trying to create things. And in your field, you can find, whatever field you're in, you can find people who are wanting to do something similar to you and get with them and arrange to meet and talk about what's going well and what sucks, and to talk about, what you need and how to get the little bits of help. And don't stop until you find that group of people, even if they're not in the same town, but they probably will be in the same town.
Well, that's really what I am discovering. I mean, even last night I led a meditation, a shamanic meditation, and we did some Kundalini yoga. And I have always been really tentative about my shamanic training and being open about it. I'm like just starting to talk about it even on the podcast. And I felt like I was just like, screw it. I'm just going to be super out there with what I'm doing.
Yes.
And it was this incredible experience for me. I mean, for me, yes. I felt like the group was so receptive, and it felt like a real bonding experience with the people that were there. And I thought, it's really a lesson of like, we just have to show up and be who we are. And
yes.
with as wild and creative and as quote unquote weird as we are, and trust that the universe will provide, and that the people will be there to receive it,
Yes. And I completely agree. And then I think it's really helpful to have either a small group or a larger group that you are checking in on all the time for the moments when you feel a little more hesitant, or when you have a wave of, a loss of confidence.
Yeah.
Or where you can't think of what's the next thing I need to do. People that you can check in with and keep coming back to. And which is why I run the year-long training that I do, is because, a group of 20 people has each other's backs for the whole year around whatever their vision is of how they want to bring the next thing that they want to bring into the world.
Why don't you talk a little bit about what you offer right now. And then I want to segue into some of the earth-based practices of dismantling the patriarchy. So tell us a little bit more about, like, how can people connect with you in terms of your offerings, and how, where is your leadership retreat?
Yeah. So I teach various retreats throughout the year, mostly in the first quarter of the year, actually, first half of the year, in all kinds of places, at Esalen, at Stanford. But the program that I really feel most passionate about is my year-long leadership program, which starts in the spring each year, and this year starts in April. And that is, it's a group of 20 to 25 people who are committed to a vision of what they want to bring into the world. And we meet 4 times during the year, 3 3-day retreats and 1 1-day retreat. Mm-hmm. And we also connect between those retreats on calls together. So that's the structure of it. But the aim is to give people a challenging and deeply respectful and loving place to get clear about who you are and what you bring into the world, and to practice bringing your full voice, and to bringing your full vision, and being the leader that you want to be. That's my favorite program to work on and develop, because this group gets really committed to each other over the year, and we get very, very connected. And we meet. The retreats are at a retreat center just south of Petaluma, about an hour north of San Francisco. Yeah, so like I say, that starts in April this year. If you're at all interested, go to the website for it, which is T12N.com. There's 12 letters between T and N in the word transformation. So the website is T12N.com.
Okay, great. And is there any like social media where people can connect with you, or LinkedIn, or?
I need to hire an assistant who can help me with that. But I do have a LinkedIn page, yes.
So thank you for that. So let's talk about psychedelics. I'm really excited about this, because this is one of the things that feels really unique and cutting edge to me. So talk to me a little bit about, well, first, let's segue from, you have this spiritual experience with the spiritual guru, as you mentioned last time.
Yes.
And now you do all this transformational leadership stuff, which we talked about. So how did you get from there to now we're in the cutting edge of psychedelic research and therapies that are involving psychedelics? Can you talk to me about the life experience that you had that bridges that gap?
Well, somehow I always knew that plant medicine, as I would call it, would be an important part of me understanding who I am and what my place is in the world, and how to make a contribution in the world. I did a lot of alcohol in my early days, and then basically stopped drinking in my mid-20s. And then I didn't experiment with anything. I wouldn't even call it experimenting, but for 25 years. And then about 10 years ago, I took a trip to South America and I did ayahuasca. And that had a very profound impact on the way that I see the world and the way that I see my place in the world, and on helping me to make myself a little bit less important and to make everything else a little bit more important. And so I think I knew that there was something in me that needed to be, that in some way that my ego needed to be strong enough to be able to experience the kind of dissolution of the ego or breaking of the ego that can happen when you take plant medicine. And so that was my experience on ayahuasca, was that I got to see myself in a whole different way. I got to see my relationship to the universe in a whole different way. And some of this really doesn't make any sense and without having had some of that experience. But I knew in myself that I needed to be really strong inside before I would enter and work with these practices. Now, in parallel to that, what was going on, which I actually didn't know about at the time, was there was a resurgence going on of research into psychedelics in mainstream hospitals around the country, and looking at the value, particularly looking at the value of psilocybin for anxiety, for end-of-life anxiety, and looking at the value of MDMA for working with trauma. And so I feel incredibly lucky that my own conviction that plant medicine is an essential part of what is going to help us to develop the kind of self-awareness and collective awareness about who we want to become as a culture and how we're going to address the major challenge of our time, which is climate change. I think plant medicine has a huge part to play in that, in reconnecting us to the earth.
Really. And see, this is, in my notes, I wrote down earth-based practices as a way of dismantling patriarchy. And I think of earth-based practices in so many different forms. Like I've never done ayahuasca. I'm fascinated by the thought of that, or really all the other stuff too. But I'm like Mormon to the core, aside from there's like so much conditioning around substances and there's so much fear for me. And yet I feel like I've used earth-based practices of ritual, of sitting in circle, of meditating with plants, of really trying to engage with the world in a way where I have felt really an awakening and a new appreciation of where it is that we've come from. And almost this idea with patriarchy that it's, to your point of earlier of extraction, this idea that it's like an extractive culture, that we just go in, we take what we need, we profit from it. And like, it doesn't, there isn't this idea, this regenerative, cyclical, the way that the earth, the way that the seasons and everything happen. And so I'm curious, so you had your experience with that, and now it does feel like the next level is, and I read this book that you had mentioned to me, which was by Michael Pollan, and the title's like 100 words long.
How to change your mind. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. How to change your mind.
Yeah.
And it's all about all of that.
Yeah.
And that really opened me up to the context of this assisted, supported way of engaging with these really powerful plant medicines that have really been used in rituals, in like ritualistic states through different cultures for forever,
I really like to use the metaphor of fire when thinking about working with plant medicine, which is that fire is really, really useful in heating our homes and in helping us cook and, various other things. And it's also one of the most destructive forces that's out there.
Yes.
And part of what happened in the 60s with the use of psychedelics was that there was a separation of the plant medicine from the ritual that holds us as we go through the experiences of plant medicine. And part of what I think is so beautiful about the way that plant medicine is reemerging along legal paths, along government-sanctioned paths in research in the major hospitals, is that we're able to use the hospital setting actually to create a form of ritual in which to use this plant medicine. It's somewhat narrow in its protocol, but it's still being used with incredible care and thoughtfulness. And the researchers and the philanthropists that are behind this are incredible people who really see the possibility for shifting consciousness.
And who are the primary candidates that are being invited into these medical trials? And
well, so the particular one that I'm connected to, which is the MAPS study of using MDMA to address untreatable PTSD, that is for people who have had traumatic experiences that they have tried to resolve but have not been able to resolve. So, vets are a prime potential group of people who are hugely benefited. But so also people who've had, single traumatic experiences at any point in their lives or chronic traumatic experiences throughout their lives. MDMA has had truly astonishing results so far in the trials, and they're currently in phase 3. And it should become, if all goes well, it would be approved by the FDA in a couple of years.
Wow.
So
really
that's
exciting.
one particular treatment that's available. But there are others for, the developing treatments for depression, for anxiety, for addiction, for eating disorders. There's a lot of different ways in which it is potentially going to be used medically.
Well, and it's interesting because as someone who's suffered from both anxiety and depression, it's very discouraging because there are solutions out there, and yet when you look at the research, we're not really any better off. Like
Right.
if you compare it to like treatments for heart disease and cancer, it's like we're kind of back to where we were and
Yeah.
20, 30 years ago. And so things are
Yeah.
not working. And so I know that there's a holistic approach to take and sometimes lifestyle shifts, and there are things that can help. But this is really
Yeah.
exciting because
Yeah.
it does feel like there could be a remedy here. And
Yes.
and so many people, I've spoken to so many people who have experienced plant medicine and
Yeah.
like you said, in a supported setting
Yeah.
with people who can where you can be assisted and held
Yeah.
in a way that isn't traumatizing.
Exactly. And it, the results for MDMA with PTSD are astonishing. I mean, traditional methods or current methods that are available treat about 25% of patients and get them to the point where they're not suffering from PTSD. So 1 in 4. The use of MDMA heals 3/4 of patients. So 3 times better success rate using MDMA, and that's 3 individual journeys on the medicine over a period of 2 to 5 months. And you have a 75% success rate. So it's not just an incremental increase, it's a revolutionary increase.
Wow.
And there are similar results coming out for various other conditions as well, for addiction and for depression and anxiety. So we're going to see a huge shift in how some of the major conditions of our time are treated, and through the use of plant medicine over the next 10, 20 years.
It's so exciting.
Yeah.
It's so exciting to think about what could be possible from that. And I mean, I know that I'm asking like a speculative question with this question, but it's like we've got this technology stuff that's come in that is so useful and so amazing and has made our lives in so many ways so much easier. And yet there's so much noise and there's so much stimulation and there's so much projection and reaction from that I often wonder that, we haven't evolved quickly enough as a species to be able to live with what's going on technologically around us. And so, we're having to numb out, or we're having, I see that we're having to really reach for technologies. And what I mean by these technologies, more like ancient, ancient breathing and yogic and shamanic and earth-based technologies to help us to return to that quiet, because our stress hormones and responses are just off the charts. And everyone I talk to, I feel like, I know I'm suffering with it. I know it's everyone I talk to is like, I'm just trying to learn how to cope.
Right. Yes, we aren't evolved for what we're living in. That's our bodies are not evolved for the society that we're currently living in.
Yeah.
And so we need remedies and settings that are closer, that in some ways return us, in some ways, not in all ways, return us to the kind of environment that we thrive in.
So then where do you see this? How do you see this being, do you see this as something that can be integrated in what you're doing in terms of leadership and leadership training and spaces? What do you think about this in terms of the future? Obviously you're talking about it in isolated cases where it's in a hospital and there's research happening but what excites you about this at its core?
Well, at the core, I'm just speak from my own experience, which is that when I have experienced some of these plant medicines, and this is edgy language to use, but I really experience that the spirit of those plants is working in me. That the plant itself has a spirit, and that spirit comes inside me and works my psyche, and opens me in various ways and heals me in various ways and helps me be creative in various ways. That's what my experience has been. And this is beyond, working with any particular medical condition that I might have. This is just what this is doing, working with my psyche. And I would say that as a result of that, there's a couple of things that have happened. One is I feel much more able to just be in my element when I'm working. That I find myself much more able to be myself while I'm doing my work. So that's one piece. And another is that it really has changed the way that I relate to the natural world. And of course, we are the natural world. And what has happened is we have kind of somehow made ourselves think that we're in some way separate from the natural world. And unless we rebuild or reconnect collectively with our being a part of the natural world, we're going to keep destroying it.
Yes.
And so the big hope that I have is that the plant medicine can become a perfectly normal portal to the divine, in which we experience our true nature and our connection to all of nature. And I think that ability to connect with the divine in ourselves and all around us has not been as accessible as it might have been, and that some ways in which some organized religions have been set up have actually been deliberately set up to separate us from having direct access to the divine.
Amen. I love so much about what you just said. Like I'm just first, like just the plant spirit. Let's just go back to the plant spirit. Okay. Because I love that. I feel like it's interesting that when you talk about like working with this plant spirit as humans, I've pondered this so much in the last couple of years as I've worked through my own faith crisis in the power of myth and the idea of humanizing. You look at like Egyptian art and Egyptian hieroglyphs, and it's like part head of a crow and the human body, and then you see it in Greek mythology and Roman mythology where it's like the body of a man and the hooves of a goat. And it makes me think that as humans, we have, I don't know if it's our ego or what it is, and that we have this want to project our humanness into everything in order for it to be relevant, or in order for us to have empathy for it in some ways. And it's interesting that when we experience everything as being alive, and everything as it, like if you're talking a plant spirit, as it's like when you say that, my human brain is like, oh yes, I can picture the tree having a soul like mine. And so now I can relate to it. And like, what do you want to tell me, tree? What do you want to tell me, plant? Whatever it is.
Isn't it funny how crazy that sounds to a modern ear? That idea.
Oh gosh, yes.
The fact that sounds crazy shows us how far we have come from really knowing our place in the scheme of things.
Right. Because even as a child, I mean, we had a family ranch that was like my great grandfather settled in Utah, and it's just been kind of passed down where we can all go, and it's a lot of extended relatives, and so I spent every summer at the ranch and, walking, and you're just like turned loose as a kid. My parents would be like, eat breakfast and don't come back until dinner. And you're just roaming in the wild.
Yes.
And it was just my imagination and plants. And, I didn't relate to the trees and the plants as alive in that way. But there's obviously, we know as humans that there's this like reverential experience when we are out and we feel the wind on our face and we feel our feet on the ground. And there's just something that rejuvenates us that no one can deny, right? Yes. No one can deny that when you're standing on a mountaintop or you're standing in front of the ocean, that there is something so renewing and so peaceful about it. And so I love the idea though, of really taking it the next step where it's like, of course there's plant realms and there's stone realms and there's, that why wouldn't we sit and think of what they would have to say to us and, and just let our minds and our creativity run wild and see what comes of that. And really that's really how we, to your point, connect to the divine and really connect to like our purest form of creativity. I love that you said that, Mark. That made
Mm-hmm.
me so happy.
Mm-hmm. I really, the book Sapiens, I really think charts how humanity's religions evolved from being animistic, pantheistic, to being monotheistic. And that has really taken away out that connection.
Yes.
From us, and it's now mediated in other ways. And I think there's a groundswell of returning to that.
Oh gosh,
Yeah.
It's everywhere you go now. And what I think is really cool is when you can find people who obviously love their monotheistic religion, whether it be Christianity or
Absolutely.
Islam, and who are also connecting
Yes.
to the earth in this way.
Exactly.
I love it when that can happen, because I think that there is a fear. There's so much fear about the either or. And that I think is systemic patriarchy, right?
Yes.
That's systemic religious patriarchy of saying like, it's either this or nothing, folks.
Yes.
Yes. But that there's really a way to relate. I mean, that's really what opened up for me when I left the church. It was like, wait, if it's not this, then what is it? And then suddenly you're open to everything.
Yeah.
Mark, anything else that you want to add on psychedelics? Thank you for sharing your personal experience.
Wow, it's a very big box to open.
I know it.
So
I know it.
Well, maybe many different directions.
Yes.
But it's a very exciting moment. I feel very lucky to be. I'm actually going out next week for one of the first trainings for therapists. I'm not a therapist, but non-therapists can also do this training to train to be able to be taking part in the FDA trials to enable MDMA to become legal. So I'm going to be part of a team of people opening a clinic here in Santa Cruz to enable people to be treated for PTSD using MDMA, and that'll be probably available sometime in the fall, September, October of this year. So it's a really incredible moment.
It does feel like that. I think that with all the noise, I just have gotten to where I don't even turn on the TV. I basically just read headlines now because I just can't deal with the noise. But I feel like underneath all of that, I have so much hope. And I have so much excitement for what's possible, because when I'm having one-on-one conversations with people, we're all kind of feeling this. It feels, it's unsettling, but it also feels like we're at the beginning of a lot of possibility and a lot of waking up, and a lot of people, hopefully we can move beyond the bipartisan and the egoic right and wrong, and really just return back to, I like what Desmond Tutu says, let's give the women power. And I like what the Dalai Lama says, which is, increase your own work. Let's all do our own work. It's just so simple, right? Except it's not.
Right.
Anyway, thank you so much for your time today, Mark.
Before we part, we'd like to say thanks for listening, and we hope you'll connect with us on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. We would love to hear from you and appreciate all feedback, shares, and likes.
To learn more and subscribe to our newsletter, visit Intentionists.com. And no matter where you are or what you're creating, we send you love and invite you to breathe and begin.
See you next week.